Hello there, and welcome to Corny and Barrow's podcast. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the 2023 vintage in Bordeaux, and I am joined by two regulars, Joe Muller
Good afternoon.
and Guy Seddon.
Hello.
Now, these chaps have been part of a contingent that we sent to Bordeaux last week. We've spent various amounts of times in Bordeaux. I say we, but Guy, you were there for 7 days, weren't you?
I was, which was great. Yeah, we went out, 4 of us, for the whole stint, and we did a lot of driving. We were mostly, to begin with, on the right bank of Bordeaux, and then moved midweek to the left bank. But yeah, we covered a lot of distance and tasted quite a few wines.
And Joe, you were there for 3 days. At what point and whereabouts did you join the team?
That's right. So I was parachuted in as part of the B team, the beta team, along with a couple of other colleagues. And after a brutal red-eye early morning flight from Gatwick at 6:15,
Ouch!
Which saw us land sort of late morning in Bordeaux, in Mérignac, to quite nice weather actually. It was a very nice welcome change to the rainy shores of Blighty. Anyway, the first day was left bank Bordeaux. The second day we focused on the right bank and with particular emphasis on Moex amongst others. And then the third day was various communes on the left bank again. Yeah, so 3 days.
Okay, all right. Guy, you're my go-to person for getting a little bit of an overview on growing seasons and stuff. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that for 2023 Bordeaux?
Okay, so just by way of a brief overview of the 23 growing season, the scene was set by a really fabulous period of flowering, which meant that the potential crop size was large. The knock-on effect that had was that a number of growers felt the necessity to do quite extensive green harvesting later in the season. Green harvesting entails cutting bunches of grapes and leaving them on the ground in order to safeguard the size and therefore quality of the eventual crop. The second factor which came into play was an attack of mildew pressure, really across the region, but it affected in particular the Merlot more than the Cabernet. And the peak of this period of mildew really was early July, and that was when the rainy, cool period of the growing season really set in. You had to be really vigilant in the vineyards and make sure that you were spraying and sending in your vineyard teams on a regular basis in order to keep mildew under control. By and large, the people we spoke to, I think, very successfully controlled it, but it was certainly something to be aware of. There were then 2 heat waves, one in late August and one in early September. The temperatures got up to the sort of low 40s. And more than the heat itself, it was really the sunburn that created some issues in the vines. Where it wasn't possible to protect against the rays of the sun, it was then necessary to deselect, so to cut off either bunches or more likely parts of bunches in order to avoid any of these sunburnt characters coming through into the resultant musts and wines. Then harvest time came, and Merlot, which ripens earlier, was generally harvested at good ripeness levels before a period of rain set in. There was a little pause while some rain happened. Some people opted to harvest Cabernet before the rain. The more successful Cabernet seems to have been those who took the more risky decision to wait, and the rain actually wasn't as extensive as had been forecast. And so the people who harvested their Cabernets after the rain actually won out, and the quality of the Cabernet Sauvignon, especially on the left bank, was really, really high, and it resulted in much more percentage proportion of Cabernet in 23 than you would have seen in previous years. The weather at the end of the growing season was really glorious. The September in particular was the warmest September since 1920, and this really set up the ripeness for a really optimal level of ripeness at picking. Picking was unhurried, fermentations were also unhurried, and And they've resulted in some really lengthy and, in some cases, some extractions which went on longer than would otherwise have been the case, and longer, greater macerations than in some years.
Okay, thanks, Guy. Joe, how therefore has all this weather and the decisions that have been made when harvesting, how has that played into the wines? What sort of wines are we going to see from the 2023 vintage?
Yeah, so I mean, I think guys, it's a real summary, so to speak, but there's lots of detail, and it gives a good picture, certainly.
Mm.
I found a sort of what I like to call myself in my own reference points a bit of a modern day classic, and by that what I mean is like the modern day now is where you've got these extremities that play in, and we've sat here many times and talked about various extremities, and 23 doesn't necessarily have crazy extremities on display, but they have been, detailed by Guy, and that came in the form of humidity attacks with due to heavy rainfalls, where mildew susceptibility was there. It came in the form of these sort of heat waves and the sunburn, but not in too extreme a way. And I think because of that, that sort of helped retain some nice classicism, because you had a sort of a real sort of idyllic sort of flowering period, which ultimately then has led to sort of generally cool, and ultimately led to what our colleague Will Hargrave loves to call an Indian summer,
Oh, he loves that. Mm.
over the ripening periods. And with this Indian summer, you've seen the phenolics manage to catch up with the ripeness in terms of just the general the crosty in terms of the sugar ripeness, etc. So with all of that, how it's sort of played into the wines, depending on when they were picked, as Guys sort of outlined already. On the whole, wines which I thought, my perception in going out there was they were going to be relatively big, and they were going to be relatively ripe and really concentrated because of that sort of heat wave period. That wasn't what we found in the case. They're actually the big surprising component was this element of freshness, and that is obviously driven by good acidity within the wines. This is a more of a low pH, high acid vintage, which then automatically makes you think it's taking a step away from textural sort of character, but that's definitely not the case in some of the wines at all. So we've got this sort of high acid driven, really fresh, lovely sort of style, slightly lower alcohols. They're not as sort of rich and concentrated as they were sort of say in 2022. However, the guys who played the waiting game, who viticulturally farmed in the correct way and made all the right decisions, have managed to get a really lovely level of ripeness within the wines, which translate into a sort of a nice sweetness of fruit. But then the big thing, I think, which will be a talking point, is the tannin. And it's all about how the tannin's been interpreted within the wines, through extraction, through picking dates, through phenolic ripeness within the grapes naturally there, and how that's all sort of played its part. And for us, and I think Guy will agree with this, there was a lot of very good wine made, and that wine has a lovely balance where the fruit profile is there, the stuffing, so to speak, is there, and then the actual structure of the wines, if they've been integrated well, the tannins they're really sort of fine grained, and they can be in abundance and they can be fruit coated, but they're really balanced to that lovely freshness that the wine brings from that acidity. However, there are some people we feel that maybe the tannin and the structure is a little bit overpowering versus the fruit and the concentration, and that's where you're getting a little bit of out of balance, on display. So it'll be one to sort of pick and choose, I think, but that's where your wine merchants come in, some critics if you follow them, and you want to listen to good advice.
Mm.
I just wanted to pick up on what Joe was saying on the tannins, because I totally agree. I think that is one of the points that will set wines apart from each other in the 23 vintage. I think it was a fairly unforgiving vintage in terms of, you had to be quite gentle in the way you made wines. And I think if you, well, I mean, let's look at the positive side. It was a vintage in which typicity really shines, and I think the best wines really show themselves to best effect in 23. There's none of this veneer of fruit or of glycerol that you can get in more concentrated, more sunny, solaire style vintages, and you don't have the forgiving kind of cushion of alcohol which you get in riper vintages. So I think there's really nowhere to hide, in the sense that if you push a bit too hard on the extraction, then I think that very clearly becomes apparent. The good thing is that Bordeaux has really never made better wines, and I think the sensitive approach to winemaking is as good as it has ever been. Which is not to say that there weren't some cases where we thought, as Joe alluded to, maybe the tannins here are a little bit out of kilter with the fruit concentration, but they were the minority, I would say. And the fact that in the Medoc you've got a full percentage point less alcohol than you had in 22, for example. I mean, that's great. In a context of people being more health conscious in terms of drinking alcohol, to be able to have this fresh, more classical style of vintage with these lower alcohols, I think is fantastic.
Yeah, just very quickly as well, just to sort of piggyback it, furthermore on Guy. I think it's also probably worth noting that sort of the drinking window. These will be sort of slightly earlier drinking wines as well. We feel, because of that those various characteristics components. We're not looking at incredibly dense fruit. We're not looking at this punch of tannin that needs to be broken down incredibly over time. Some of these wines we have tasted do have these layers up to a sort of a bigger, bolder degree, but they will be drinking earlier. There's a really nice aromatic profile that can be found in some of them. I think the Cabernet, Left Bank Cabernet, particularly this year, had a real sort of lovely florality about it and gave a lot of aromatic profile where you certainly did not have it wasn't as obvious, and if not necessarily as present as it was in 22, because it was more about the fruit and then sort of the various tones and characteristics that the fruit profile was giving. And I think that adds a really nice dimension to 23. It's going to give a lot of pleasure to people, because myself, and I've said it here before, I take enormous, love from the aromatic profile of wines.
And I think that's something that there's an element of the unknown there still, because, the aromatics, I agree, are beautiful in 23, but that's something that really needs to be preserved during the élevage process. And, we often taste these wines at this very early stage. And the unknown element is always, well, let's hope that these aromas do persevere and that they are retained in the finished wine, because I think it's so nicely pitched between fruit concentration, but also that aromatic expression that, let's just hope that comes good. I think it will. Yeah. And I think people know what they're doing.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Guy, how did our organic and biodynamic friends fare? We talked about mildew. Were they affected in any way by how they could deal with that?
I think in general, we didn't speak to anybody who had recently started with organics or biodynamics. I suspect that might have been more tricky in a year like this. But certainly for already established practitioners of both, I think it gives you a robustness in the vines, which actually, in a way, gives you more predictable yields, I think, than would be the case if you were not in organics or biodynamics. So I think, one of the great boons from being organic or biodynamic is that you do have this more resilient vineyard. And I think in a vintage where there were these challenges in the vines, I think that was a great advantage for people who had a mature approach to organics and biodynamics.
Okay. So, chaps, in our most recent podcast, we talked about a survey that we sent out to our customers, which was very interesting reading. When you were over in Bordeaux, did you have a chance to get any feedback from the producers themselves? How do we feel pricing is going to be? Are they listening? How do we think the producers are going to handle the 2023 release?
It's a good question, and I'll let Joe talk in a sec about his brilliant approach to pre-orders this year, which is something new that we've done in the 23 vintage. In terms of just the general scene setting stuff, as I wrote in our pre-tasting sort of overview, there are really three factors at play in terms of the market. Firstly, the wider economy, and there's nothing we can do about that, and there's very little that's really worth saying that people don't know, other than life has become more expensive and interest rates are significantly higher than they were in previous years, and therefore that will bring a new dynamic to people's consideration of whether to buy, and also of Chateau's ability to price the wines at a certain level. In terms of the market for Bordeaux itself, which is the sort of second factor, we've had some very, very good vintages really since 2009 to 2010 onwards, but the market has seen a sort of radical about turn, if you like. And I mean, the high point of the sort of Bordeaux fever was that 2010 en primeur campaign when wines were released at very, very high prices. And the reality is that some of those release prices are still some of those wines are still underwater, in terms of the market prices of those wines today. So the Bordeaux market has struggled really since the 2010 vintage, with the possible exception of the 2019, which was released in the middle of COVID and was sold at a really interesting discount to previous vintages, and sold very well. And that was a successful campaign. But since then, prices have gone up and up. And the scene is now set for, the 21 vintage was not successful, I think, pretty much universally. 22 was a sort of ho-hum success. I mean, we did sell some good wine, but, we could have sold a lot more if prices were more compelling. And so the mood is definitely that there needs to be a price cut this year. As to where that price cut needs to be, I don't know. I mean, there was a couple of surveys were sent out to the trade before the tastings, and the consensus seemed to be that around a 30% price cut versus last year is what the market would be expecting. But it does really go on a case-by-case basis, and there were some chateaux that have gone up enormously. There are others that have been more reasonable over the past couple of years. And so this sort of leads into this great work that Joe and his team have done in terms of really benchmarking on a wine by wine basis where we believe the market to lie.
So, Joe, what was the vibe that you were getting from producers in Bordeaux? Because I think we did share our findings with some of them, didn't we?
So I think ultimately a mixed bag. I mean, Guy's probably got a little bit more exposure to him just from being there for a longer period and meeting more producers. But the ones that I conversed with and had a good conversation about, and that's the best ones tend to be either over lunch or dinner, where you've got their captured attention for a little while, and you can really bounce off of them. But ultimately, during a busy primeur week, when you're going to the actual chateau visits rather than UGC, that's the second best opportunity to sort of have a natter with them. And I know Guy and the guys there on the other team managed to do so too. So in terms of the mixed bag, some people were, I think applauded the feedback in terms of us being proactive enough to sort of canvas opinion and show. We are a Bordeaux house, we do care, and that's what we want to pass on our messages to there. And in terms of response on the various feedback and onto price, it feels like they're aware that it's obviously a sensitive time, without going into all the details again, for various reasons, that the market is soft and has softened considerably over the last 15, 18 months, the fine wine market. So, there's a definite sort of nod and understanding that action does need to be taken. I guess where the opinion will differ is how far down the line people are willing to go. Now, this also brings into conversation about, percentages, and when you've got an estate that's making some wonderful wines and perhaps, for 30, 40 euros a bottle versus an estate where their wine is released at 300, 400 euros a bottle, 20%, 30%. I don't think you can feel it's fair to sort of have the same percentage carried on from the sort of the bigger estate onto the smaller one, because the net cash margin that they will be generating will just be eroded away. And it's also they maybe haven't necessarily has played a yo-yoing effect at the smaller level with their increases over the sort of the last 5 years, where the sort of the more classified Cru Class A have in Bordeaux. And I think with the smaller estates, you need to sort of remember that it's a fixed cost ultimately, and they whatever they're doing on top of that, is where they're ploughing into the wine and trying to make the best wine possible at that level. So for me, and this is off the back of looking at, Guy mentioned our pre-order form, and it's a new mechanic that we've decided to implement this year at Corny and Barrow, which was, we selected the wines which we feel and have an affinity towards. It's ones that we've got a history with, that we've sold for many years. Relationships are there. Our customers have demonstrated they have interest in that from their buying patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And we've looked at each wine by wine, looked at the last 4 years in terms of their release pattern to see what their behavior has been like. Because, from 19 to 20, some people went up quite substantially. Others were sort of a little bit more moderate. And then 21, some people went down, some people stayed the same, some people went up. So we looked at wine by wine analysis on that front. We also looked at what the prices are of older vintages in the market, because some estates, quite a few in fact, unfortunately, between 19 and 2022 have been up sort of between 40 and 45%, which is a considerable amount of increase. Now, if dropping 10 or 20% on the 22 price might sound generous, going down 20%, but ultimately, where does that sit in a consumer's eye? Is that they will see, well, 20% drop might be, in the chateau's eyes, a very generous offer of an olive branch. However, they could turn around and say, well, we can buy 2020 cheaper because the market's dropped 40% on that wine. So we had a look at all of those components as well of older vintages. And then obviously we just took into account the state of affairs on the market itself. And
Mm-hmm.
it was a very time consuming exercise, but we feel that we have come up with what we think is fair pricing. It'll be interesting to see how many of the estates fall within our brackets. It's also worth noting that our bracket on the price, which is what we feel should be the fair, we are recommending as the fair market buy price for these wines. We're trying to keep the band quite narrow as well, because putting a larger spread is just, it's just giving yourself a little bit more chance. And we're trying to sort of not send a message, but be honest and deliver Bordeaux and Primeur with as much integrity as we can.
Mm.
It'll be interesting to see the our price bands versus reality, definitely. And I think, as Joe alluded to, we've been quite brave in terms of keeping the bands quite narrow. I think the temptation would be to have a vast spread and to say, "Yep, look, we've come within our estimate." But by keeping it really quite narrow, then we've taken a bit of a risk, and we've really said to customers, this is where we believe the market should genuinely be for this wine. And I think that's it's the first time we've done that, so we'll see what happens. But it is our genuine opinion on a wine by wine basis. Just picking up on the Bordeaux survey, because we did discuss this with quite a few of the producers when we were in Bordeaux. And the one outcome that a number of them picked up on, and I think this is not necessarily telling people anything that they didn't already know, but a lot of them mentioned this finding, which was that the vast majority of customers of C&B, and I imagine the same goes for customers of other merchants, if they don't buy a specific wine during the En Primeur campaign, they won't then buy it in the future. So I think, there's always this temptation to think, oh, well, I won't buy it now because, who knows, the price might come down, or, circumstances may change. I may decide not to pay for storage charges for the intervening years. But from a producer's perspective, they've almost got this window of opportunity to show a compelling price to the wine buying, the wine loving public, and get them to engage with the new vintage of their wine. And if they miss that opportunity, then it really is an opportunity missed. So I think that's quite a strong message to send to Bordeaux.
Yes. Okay, chaps. So whilst you're in Bordeaux doing all of that tasting, did any wines jump out at you? How about you give me 3 picks, each of you? Joe?
3 picks. So, well, yeah, I mean, the first one actually, it's probably quite easy, and that was Le Fleur Petrus this year. So we went and spent a late morning tasting with the Moex in Le Bourne in the office, and then actually had lunch with a couple of them afterwards, which was wonderful. But during that, Le Fleur Petrus just jumped out enormously to me this year. I thought it was the reason being, I'm a huge Trottemont fan, and it is a brilliant wine, but I was sort of ever so slightly felt Le Fleur Petrus sort of edged it. It was this beautiful, sort of almost playful wine at times. And what I particularly loved is that there was this sort of femininity and masculinity to the wine, and it had that dance of both sides really beautifully. On the left bank, I was probably most impressed with the day after from memory, Pichon Lalonde. Um,
Hmm.
it had classic Pauillac character, but it had an unbelievable refinement. And it was going back to what we were talking about earlier on with that sort of structure, the way that it had harmony and it had that balance of fruit profile, a sweetness, a gentle sucrosity, but it had these tannins that framed, that gave structure, beautiful freshness that just came in this sort of waves, and that all knitted together in a very long finish. So it was a beautiful wine. But then I'd probably sort of say on the I think it's fun to sort of give a in inverted commas cheapy option, something value end, and that would probably be Capburn. So I thought Capburn was wonderful. It showed some drive, some verve. However, it also showed again a sort of a side that gave an almost enticing sort of character from its fruit profile and that aromatic
Hmm.
side. So yeah, that'd be my three for now.
Sounds charming. Guy?
Okay, well, three wines from the vintage. I'd better pick something from the right bank and something for the left bank, at least, I suppose. The first name to mention is Peter Sissek's Rocheron from Saint-Emilion. Now, this is a wine that we have worked with in the UK exclusively since the inaugural 2010 vintage. And it's a wine which, as with so many of Peter's wines, is all about the limestone soils. So, you can really see the whole of Peter Sissek's winemaking career as a sort of search for the ultimate expression of limestone. And I think that's what Rocheron 2023 does beautifully. It really does captures this nervy sort of limestone chalky minerality of Saint-Emilion on the plateau. And it's a beautiful, beautiful wine, which we will be releasing in due course. Um, Secondly, I'd go across to the other side, so across to Saint Julien, and single out Leoville Barton, which is a wine that I know has many followers, both in the UK and elsewhere. Barton this year was particularly high in Cabernet Sauvignon, so it was almost 90% Cabernet Sauvignon this year, and is a really good example of one of the 23s where Cabernet really flourished and really has resulted in a very expressive, lively, fresh, upbeat example of the vintage. And then to finish off, I can't not mention the wonderful, under the radar, no brainer that is Roc de Com from the Côte de Bourg. This is Francois Micheville's wine from slightly further north from Tertre-Haute-Boeuf, which is his high profile Saint-Emilion wine. But Roc de Com really is tantalizingly under the radar still, and is, if you show a lineup of Bordeaux's blinds to people, it will so often surprise people by punching way above its weight. And 2023, in that sense, is no exception. So yeah, there you go. Three of my picks of the vintage.
Nice.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I guess to round off, I just want a little quick summary of the 2023 wines then. How would you describe the 2023 vintage? How would you compare it?
Okay, well, I would start by saying that 2023 is a vintage of typicity. It's a vintage of freshness. It's a vintage of transparency. And what I mean by transparency is that you can really see the definition. You can see what wines are all about and where they're from. I think it is a lovely expression of a particular growing season, of a particular set of circumstances that's neither fruity nor underripe. It's perfectly pitched in a sense that would have been quite hard to make even 10 years ago. But I think the advances in viticulture and winemaking has made almost a new style of vintage, of luminosity. And I think 2023 will go down as, in a sense, a sort of example of the new Bordeaux.
Okay. Joe, do you have any different way to look at it or phrase it? How would you describe it?
No, I agree. Yeah, completely. I mean, I think from what I liked, what I found the most enjoyable were the wines, and they were sort of slightly playful, but they made you think. They're not obvious in charm, although there is more charm than you anticipated that the vintage showed. And I think that sort of not intellectual, but it's a style and a vintage that asks you to sort of really concentrate and sort of dig into what the wine has to offer. And that's just in its early stages. I think they're going to unfurl generally quite nicely. I think they are terroir driven styles, as Guy's alluded to. The Merlot on limestone and the Merlot on clay on the right bank is giving two very different but beautiful pictures. And the Cabernet, versus gravel versus granite and limestone is again once very, very, very different scenarios. So they're wines to explore and to enjoy exploring. So one for the sort of the ponderers, really.
All righty. Well, thank you so much. I know that you're both very, very busy. The campaign has just kicked off in earnest. We've had some releases today. I appreciate you spending time. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you.
And Guy. I hope to speak to both of you again soon.
Thanks, Tree.
Thanks, Tree.